I started teaching right after I got out of college because my husband was still in school, and we needed somebody to work, and so I'd always loved teaching and young people, and so I started doing that. I was teaching foreign languages at the time, and when we moved out here, and I was thinking I sort of wanted to start a new career, what I really loved teaching and talking about is literature. And I couldn't do that with foreign languages at that point. They weren't teaching them at an advanced level. It was just lists of vocabulary and grammar rules and stuff like that. Not very interesting. So I got another degree in English so that I could teach English, because I could teach literature that way. So I started doing that. And then I began to be aware that there were students who weren't succeeding because they perceive things in a different way. They're usually labeled dyslexic. And so I took special training to be able to teach kids who were struggling with dyslexia. And it was a very highly organized method, sequenced very carefully. And that was the inspiration for the youth song. It was those kids that I was teaching because I just felt they should have a book that was written with a vocabulary that was easily decodable or very familiar, so that it would not be difficult for them to read, and it should be a message that would help them be successful, that would help them realize their uniqueness and importance to the world and to God. And so that was how the youth song came to be.
Well,
that was my first book.
I really appreciate you taking us through the history of how the youth song, I think about this, and more recently how we often compare ourselves, and I don't know if I've met anybody who doesn't do it. The world has standards, and they change. They change with the times. They're different based on culture and age and different things, but the world tells you, you're here now, and this is how you ought to be. You're this age now, and this is how you ought to be. You're in this culture, and this is how you ought to be. Or you're this gender, this is how you ought to be. And a lot of us, like when you were saying, what drove you to start the youth song, the dyslexic children, a lot of us, we know we don't measure up to what the world is saying. This is where you should be, but it's not the world standard we should follow. But that standard is all around us while we're here. It's all around us. So it's thank God for people like you who show that there is another way, a better way, in things like your work in the youth song. So I thank you very much for that. Now, I wanted to ask you, for years you taught children. You talked about working with dyslexic children. You wanted to work with foreign language. Where did the passion to teach children come from in you? Was your mother a teacher, your father a teacher? Where did that come from?
I guess there may have been some teachers back in my ancestry, but my parents, neither one of them were teachers. But it just always appealed to me. I don't know. I used to even make believe, when I was a kid. It had a lot of appeal to me.
And I'm sure your students I'm sure they appreciate the fact that you followed that dream. I'm sure I can only imagine the lives that you have touched. What did you dream of becoming? Having said that, you said your parents weren't teachers. You don't know where it came from, but you always wanted to teach. When you were really young, was that your greatest passion? Some kids want to be an astronaut. Some kids want to be a nurse. Is that what was always your dream? You wanted to be a teacher?
I can't say that really was always my dream. The silly thing is that the era that I grew up in, it was just kind of, you're going to grow up and you're going to get married. So it was meeting the right guy was the big dream.
Real?
And, it's silly to think now, but that, that was what my mother, she really could have been a very successful actress, I think. That was her passion.
Wow.
But, that doesn't kind of fit in too well with, marriage and family and all that. And once she met my dad, she just gave that all up. And,
we were talking, and one of the things about this show was the importance of never giving up. And, sometimes if you don't fit in, you feel like I don't belong in this world, so let me take myself out of it, to the importance of never giving up. And, again, running across people because the world does have a standard, and people will let you know when you're not suited up to the world standard. You're not the right weight. You don't look right. You don't talk right. You're not meeting the world standard. So it's just very, very important to know that the world standard is not our guide. But when you said that, I thought about my grandmother. Again, I was going back to the world standard. Years ago, the world standard was a woman, your goal was to grow up and hope that somebody asked you to marry them. And maybe you thought, well, nobody's asked me, so somebody who could be abusive, maybe they have alcoholism, they asked you, and you're like, I better say yes, because that's the most a woman can hope for. And we don't know what that's done to families through the generations. But my grandmother told me when she was young, if you were 18 and you weren't married with kids, people looked at you like something was wrong with you. And now, if you're 18 and married with kids, people look at you like something's wrong with you. But before it was just the opposite. Before it was just the opposite. That's why it's so important not to live by the world standard, but by God's, because they're totally, totally different. Joanne, how old were you when you knew that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, it's an interesting thing because I really don't think of myself as a writer. I think more of my books that they came to me as kind of an assignment from above, and I had to write those books. It's amazing. About 30 years evolved between the time I got the idea for Daughter of Jerusalem and the time it actually got published. It was about 30 years that intervened.
Wow.
And with the You Song, it was about 10. And in both cases, it just kind of stuck there in the back of my mind. It kept nudging me, and it was like, you're really not going to have completed your life, what you're meant to do here until you write these books. It wasn't like, I want to be a writer, so I'm going to sit here and write. It was like, here's this book that has to come into the world, and you're the one, so get busy. So it was really different.
Oh, my goodness. What that in itself is just your evolvement. You don't see yourself as a writer, although you have 2 published books. I would say you are, but that you felt that it was the type of book that was important. So you told us about what inspired you working with children you wanted to help who had dyslexia, what inspired you to write the You Song, and you and your daughter collaborated as far as the design and the covers for the You Song and the Daughter of Jerusalem. So when you were a teacher, did you spend most of your time working with students who did have dyslexia and other reading challenges?
That was just at the end, toward the end. When I was originally a teacher, it was just in a classroom. And at first, when I started teaching, I couldn't imagine any reason why a student wasn't successful other than they weren't trying hard enough. That's how much I knew about it. And so, this was just all, I'd say I taught grades about 7th to 12th, because I taught a subject rather than teaching a grade. And
Mm-hmm.
so then I found out a friend of mine was doing academic language therapy, they call it. Academic language being reading and writing, right, as opposed to speaking. And, she was finding it very rewarding. And so I just decided I would take the training. And the wonderful thing about it is that it makes a major difference in these kids' lives. It's what turns them around. And I found the training, was so helpful that even as a rookie, I was able to really, really help people just following the recipe, so to speak. So that was really encouraging.
So you thought, and thank you for your open-mindedness, you thought the child just isn't trying hard enough. I don't remember, it was years ago when I started hearing about dyslexia, then we learned later about ADD and ADHD. When do you remember people starting to see, not telling a child, try harder, try harder, try harder, you're not focusing, you're not paying attention, to know it's dyslexia? When do you remember the school systems, that aha moment going off that, okay, let's stop beating up on the kids saying they're distracted, they're not paying attention, they're not trying hard enough, that there might be something else going on? I wonder how many children, before they learned about dyslexia, got labeled like being disorganized, not paying attention, being lazy, not caring enough. At what point do you remember it was the school system saying there's actually a medical condition behind this?
I really couldn't pinpoint a year when that happened. I know when my kids were in school that, they were having special programs for gifted kids. They were, pulling kids out for special help. I still remember remedial reading, as a phrase that was used. So I think for a pretty long time, they have been doing that, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly when that started.
Can you give us a glimpse of the You Song for our off-the-shelf listeners who may be parents or school teachers? They may work with children in daycares, etc., and this is new to them. Can you give us a glimpse of the You Song?
I sure could. I'm going to read the first few pages and then kind of tell you how it goes on. How about that?
Okay.
You are a song. The You Song rings out in your smile, in your voice, in your hugs. You are a song like no other song God's ever sung. Let that song fill your part of His world with joy sounds. And then it goes on to say how, what if the You Song seems to be out of tune? What do you do to get back the happy tones of the You Song? Because we all have that experience sometime. And also, how do you blend the You Song with the other songs around you? And I wanted the illustrations to be children of, different genders, different races, so that every child could look at this book and, kind of identify with some of the pictures in it. And just so grateful for the way those illustrations worked out, because I'm not an artist. And I had kind of thought it had to be an artist that would illustrate it, and that was the main thing that held up the publication for 10 years, because I had the poem written pretty quickly, though I did revise it a lot over those 10 years. And then the thought occurred to use photographs, which really makes it even more realistic. It's really kind of nice. And so my daughter, Megan, she knows of these stock photo websites. And so she found one that offered a whole month where you could take 25 photos per day for a set fee. So we just searched that website until we found the perfect photo for each of the pages and narrowed it down to the ones that we have. And I'm really pleased with the final results there, pairing the photos with the words of the poem. And I want to share one story which was really precious to me, because one of the photos was inspired by one of my students who was struggling with dyslexia and so forth. And this was after I'd finished teaching her, but I was over at her house visiting, and I just took out the manuscript of the poem. It didn't have any illustrations at this point, and read it to her. And there was one page that she loved so much, and it was the thought that no other song can take your place. And that meant a lot to her. It meant so much to her because her mom had just had a baby girl, and she was feeling as if, maybe she would displace her. And so she said to me, you should have a picture for that of a little girl hugging her pregnant mommy. And so that is what we have on that page. So
okay.
Actually
now,
so you help me.
and that is, you're getting it straight from the source. With, you talked about some of the challenges. So are there like specific challenges that you bring up in the You Song that a child might be dealing with?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite clear on the question there.
Are you so let's say challenges that a child might be dealing with, dyslexia being one. It could be maybe they're the youngest in their family and they feel like nobody will include them in. Their older siblings keep telling them that they're too young. Are there any like challenges that a child deals with that you address in the You Song?
Well, it's mainly just, how the world's jangle tries to muffle that You Song, and any of these would be ways that it tries to do that, wouldn't it? Saying, you're not good enough, and, not to value what God is doing within you, and trust it and be able to let it come out. And it comes out so much in our relationships with others, to when you do something kind for somebody else, that really can break through that sense of not being good enough or whatever it is. But but it's much simpler than that. It's not addressing particular individual problems, and it's not focusing on the problems. It's really focused on keeping that You Song flowing into the world.
And I'm thinking about a woman who has a program, and I see her face in my mind's eye, and your authentic self. She always talks about the importance of being authentic, and it's just something that is coming up more to me lately, how the world has a standard. It really does, and we break our necks to meet that world standard, but God has a different standard, and they're totally different. And the world standard changes based on the times, based on what's going on. Just like we were both talking earlier years ago, if you were a woman, your life goal was you hoped and prayed some man asked you to marry you, and soon, so you wanted to be a wife and a mother, and that was it. If you had any other dreams, you dropped them, and so that was the world standard then. Well, it's changed now. So, but God's standard never changes. In what ways, especially if we have a listener, could be not only a parent but an adult going through something, and they might feel like, I don't measure up. I feel like I'm always the outcast, and I'm tired of that. In what ways, when you say being Your Song, can you describe that more completely to somebody? It might connect with somebody who's struggling with that. When you say your song, can you describe more what you mean by that? Your own particular song.
We each are unique, and we each have individual way of expressing God's goodness and singing his praises. And I think it does take some time communing with him to really understand what that's about. But as I said before, I think that expressing love to others is the most important thing that we do. And it may take different forms in different professions. And, you know, if we are letting God guide us instead of the world around us trying to shape us into its mold, then we're not going to be far off track. And, of course, we can always change track as we go along, can't we? You know, we're never stuck, you know. We can always change if it doesn't prove to be the right direction that we're headed in.
Yeah, and we know God's gifts to us are peace and joy. So when those are missing, we know, ooh, I must have made a wrong turn, or I'm using my thoughts wrong. Like at the start of the show, maybe you're worrying, and you got to stop that habit. Something has gone wrong. Have you thought, Joanne, about getting the U Song in schools and daycares? I wanted to ask you, if so, what has that experience been like?
Well, I need to do a lot more than I have. I really think it would be wonderful in schools because it's helpful as an early reader as well. And in very young children really get it and warm to it. So even before they can read, I think it's a wonderful thing for parents too to be able to discuss with their children. It raises lots of important questions that children can be thinking about.